Hi, welcome to Botany 101. I'm Angela Nishimoto. Today's topics we're doing stems, okay? Stems, the organs. Remember that the organs are the roots, stems, and leaves, and flowers, fruits. So today we have an outline of the topics. First of all, we're going to go into the functions of the stem, okay? Functions of the stem and also functions of different parts of the stems. We're going to talk about tissues from the apical meristem. Okay, remember we talked about that before when we talked about roots, but in this ways we're going to be talking about tissues from the apical meristem of the stem. We're going to be talking about secondary meristems. Remember, you have primary meristems and secondary meristems. One is growth in length, that's primary meristems. The second is growth in girth or in broadness, that's secondary meristems. Then we're going to talk again about the differences between dicots and monocots, adding a little bit more onto what you already have found out. Okay. Then we're going to go into specialized stems of various types, and there's maybe about maybe more than half a dozen that we're going to go over. And then lastly, we're going to talk about wood. Okay? So what does the stem do? Okay, the stem provides support, okay, support of the leaves, okay, because the leaves do photosynthesis, right? So the leaves are actually on the stem and the stem supports the leaves. The leaves are like solar panels turned to the light, right? So the stem supports the leaves. Okay. Another thing the stem does is it functions in transport. Okay. So it moves water from the root into the stem, into the leaf, okay, out of the leaf through spores called stomates. Okay. And then in the leaves themselves you have photosynthesis going on. Photosynthesis which takes carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and converts it into sugars, a form of chemical energy, right? So the plants do that in their leaves. And then the photosynthate, or the sugar, is then translocated through the phloem. Remember the phloem? Actually, it's translocated via the phloem to other parts of the plant, including the roots or the stem, depending on where the sugar is stored, or whether it's stored as starch, or whether it's used. Okay? The third function of the stem is storage, okay? So this here is a cactus, as you can probably tell. Okay, it's not always easy to tell what a cactus is, but this is definitely a cactus, okay? And here you have parts of this. So this actually serves as not only a photosynthetic stem, but also serves as storage for water and or carbohydrates, okay? Finally, stems can do reproduction. Remember we talked about roots and root suckers? That roots can actually function in asexual reproduction, or so can stems. Stems can do asexual reproduction in some cases, just as some roots do. Okay? Now we're going to go over first the external form of a woody twig. Okay, we're going to talk about the parts of a stem. Okay, the first part we're going to talk about are nodes. Okay, nodes, N-O-D-E-S. Nodes are where the leaf is attached. Okay, so here would have been where a leaf was before, because these are woody stems that have lost their leaves. But in the springtime, you're going to have more leaves coming out where the nodes are. So here's a node, here's a node, and this is where the leaf is attached or the leaf would have been attached. Okay, now between nodes you have the internodes. Okay, so both the node and the internode are places on the stem. Okay, so only stems have nodes and internodes, and internodes are the areas between the nodes. Okay, so this is a node, this is a node, and the area between the node is the internode. Okay, so here's an internode, here's an internode. Okay, so internodes are the areas, it's a place on the stem between the nodes. Okay, now on the stem you usually have buds. all right? And buds can be either terminal or apical, like these at the very tip, okay? Or they can be axillary or lateral. So terminal means at the end, apical means on the top. So both terms apply to buds at the tip of the stem, okay? Now the axillary buds or the lateral buds, they actually occur in the axil between the stem and the leaf that would have been here, okay? Or they're on the side. Lateral means on the side, okay? So what these do is that the apical bud actually helps to maintain apical dominance. It keeps the plant growing in an upward direction or in a lengthwise direction, okay? It keeps growing in length. So if you were to actually top it or cut off the apical bud, the hormones that are produced there would actually be stopped from being translocated into the axillary bud. So generally the apical buds are where the hormone is produced that are translocated to the axillary buds or the lateral buds, and then the lateral buds are kept from sprouting out, okay, because a bud is where you can actually have a stem growing out of, right? So the buds actually are prevented from them. So if you actually clip the top of a stem, cut it off, or if by some accident that happens, okay, what usually happens is that the apical dominance is broken, and then you have more of a more bushy plant or more side shoots coming out, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to go look at some of these things that we're talking about. Okay, first of all, we're going to look at a stem, okay? So here we have a stem of llama. Okay, llama is also known as Diospyros amujensis. It's a native endemic plant. That means that it exists naturally in Hawaii and nowhere else in the world. Okay, here we have a good example of a woody twig. This part is woody, this part is not because it doesn't have its secondary growth yet. Okay, but here on the twig is actually the node. The node is a place on the stem where the leaf can come off of, okay? So this one here has a node here, has a node here, and at the node, okay, at the nodes, you have both the leaf and you also have the axillary bud or the lateral bud that you can see here. It's kind of tiny, yeah? But here you have the node, and the area between the two nodes, which is known as the internode. Remember that the node and the internode are places on the stem. They're actually places on the stem, okay? So if one thing you're going to come away from this lecture with is that stems have nodes and internodes, okay? Roots do not have nodes and internodes, okay? Leaves do not have nodes and internodes, okay? But stems do, okay? So here you have the node, the internode, the axillary bud or the lateral bud, and here at the tip, you have the apical bud or the terminal bud. Okay, the terminal bud, of course, is at the very tip. Terminal or apical at the very tip or at the very end. Okay, so we have node, internode, axillary bud, and terminal bud or apical bud. Okay, now we're going to take a look at this plant here. Okay, remember that we looked at this when we were looking at adventitious roots, right? So I'm using this plant to demonstrate that you can actually get some snips and cut it. Yes, you can cut off the leaves, maybe one set of leaves, right? And then what you can do is you can actually put the leaf into some soil, as long as you cover the node, because then the adventitious roots will come out and keep the plant growing. So you can actually do this vegetative reproduction or asexual reproduction with this plant this way, firming it around. Because earlier I'd actually taken that little needle and stuck the wooden part of it into, because this pot is kind of root bound. Okay, that means that there are a lot of roots in there. Okay. Now the third thing I wanted to show to you is this ponytail palm, which is my plant. Okay, one of the things you can see is that it used to have a stem here, but it's been topped. Over at our apartment building, we've actually had some work being done, and the workmen actually decapitated my plants. Okay, I don't know how they did it, but it was an accident, you know, so I don't hold any grudges, but still, it was my plant. Anyway, what happened was that since the apical bud was decapitated off this, then that allowed these that were not here before to actually grow, like these little buds here on the stem further down. Okay, so what you have here is a removal of apical dominance. Okay, so after this part, this center part actually was broken off, and I trimmed it because I wanted to make it a little neater. It was actually torn off the plant. Okay, then you had these little buds coming out at the side, and then after several months, it's been several months since then, here we have a plant that's growing more. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you, sort of like vegetative growth, and also the getting rid of the apical dominance. Okay? Okay, here we are again. The next thing we want to look at is something called phyllotaxy. Okay, that has to do with the way that leaves are arranged on the stem. Okay, one way is called alternate leaf arrangement. Now, on the ponytail palm, it was in a whorl. But it's actually a form of alternate leaf arrangement where the leaves alternate from one side to the next, to the next, to the next. And generally, alternate leaf arrangement also means that there is one leaf at the node. Okay? Now, opposite leaf arrangement, which you see in this second one, the one in the middle. Okay? You have two leaves at each node, and they're opposite each other. That's why it's called opposite leaf arrangement. Okay, plants such as noni, such as gardenia, and rubiaceae show this opposite leaf arrangement. You'll see more of this in the next lecture. Okay, and if you have three or more leaves at each node, it's called a whorl leaf arrangement. Okay, so 3 or more leaves per node. Now the leaves themselves, okay, are made up of the blade, this part here, okay, which is a flattened part. Usually it's flattened because they act as solar panels, okay, harvesting light energy from the sun, okay. And then you have a part of it called the petiole, which is a leaf stem that connects the blade or lamina to the actual stem itself, okay. Now sometimes petioles also have stipules. Okay, stipules are pairs of appendages that are at the base of the petiole, but this one doesn't have it, but I just wanted to mention it because it is in the text. Okay. Now we have some plants that are deciduous. Okay, and when plants are deciduous, that means a plant loses leaves. Okay, like you see this beautiful fall coloration. Yeah? So when the plant loses leaves, in some cases, like in temperate areas that have actual seasons, the chlorophyll breaks down, and then what you can see are the carotenoids, the red and the orange and the yellow and the brown. And that makes a beautiful fall coloration that you can see, like in the Blue Ridge Mountains or even in Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, right? So you actually have this beautiful fall coloration, and then the plant loses its leaves, the leaves finally drop, and then over the winter and into the next year, they'll start to decay and release their nutrients back into the soil for the plant to take up again in the new season. Okay, that's in temperate areas. Now in Hawaii, we have a different kind of deciduousness, okay, that generally some plants like plumerias and vili vili, you know, the Erythrina salmachensis, which is a native Erythrina, they will actually lose their leaves during the dry period, okay, before they flower, all right? Okay, so that is deciduousness in plants. Okay, now we're going to talk about the development, okay, in plants. Okay, so first of all, we have the apical meristem. We just talked about that. Do you remember where the meristem is? Remember that a meristem is tissues where cells are actively dividing, right? And the apical meristem is at the tips of roots and at the tips of shoots, right? And they allow for primary growth or growth in length, okay? Growth in length, right? And this primary growth gives rise to primary tissues, which in the stem are very similar to those that are in the root and not identical. Okay, they give rise to the protoderm. Okay, so the protoderm actually develops into the epidermis, right? So the protoderm comes from the apical meristem and develops into the epidermis, which you remember is usually a single cell thick, okay, 1 cell thick. In some cases it's more, but usually the epidermis is 1 cell thick. Then you have another primary tissue called the ground meristem. Okay, from the ground meristem you have the cortex and the pith developing. Okay, so these are mainly parenchyma tissues, okay, which either store or manufacture food. Okay, then thirdly, you have the procambium, okay, which becomes vascular tissues. The procambium produces primary xylem and primary phloem. Okay, remember xylem is a tissue that moves water in the plant. Okay, and phloem is a tissue in the plant that moves sugars or food. So all of these tissues arise from primary growth, and they're called primary tissues. Okay, now here we have a couple of 3 images here. Okay, this is actually showing you the tip of a shoot. This is probably coleus. Okay, and here you have the apical meristem, the very tip of the shoot. The terminal or apical meristem here, you can see how small the cells are. They look dark like that because the nuclei are actually crowded together because the cells are small. Because when cells first divide, they're first small and then they expand. Remember that happened in the root too, right? We'll talk about that in a second. Here on the sides, you can see some axillary buds, also with this meristematic tissues, which can potentially become new stems. Okay, and here you have something called the leaf primordia, also known as developing leaves. And here you can actually see the vascular trace. This will become vascular tissue in the leaf. And on this leaf too, you can actually see some trichomes. Remember trichomes are hairs, right, that are on leaf or on the stem. Okay, so you have the apical meristem. Okay, apical meristem, the leaf primordia, the axillary buds. Okay, lateral meristems. Okay, so this is actually showing a close-up of this. Okay, which is the apical meristem at the shoot, and here we'll have the apical meristem at the root. Okay, so remember the root is a little review here. You have the part of the root called the root cap. The root cap is protective in function. It serves to protect the delicate tissues that are behind it. This part here, which is the apical meristem of the root, okay, which is also known as the region of cell division. And remember, you also have the region of elongation, and you also have the region of maturation, where the root hairs occur. Okay? Now, secondary meristems, we were just talking about primary meristems or apical meristems. Now we have secondary meristems, which allow for secondary growth or growth in girth. Okay, so that allows for the widening of the stem. All right, and this widening comes from meristem known as the vascular cambium. Okay, that's one of the lateral meristems, and we can actually see in this illustration here, which is a very good one. This is actually one of a woody dicot. Okay, so the vascular cambium is this one thin row of cells that occur between these tissues here, which are xylem, secondary xylem, and these tissues here, which are secondary phloem and also fiber cells. Okay, so why don't we actually go through all these parts, okay, of the stem cross-section. Okay, first of all, since this is a woody stem, this part is a wood, okay, the outer part is called the cork or the bark, also known as the periderm. Okay, and what produces this is the cork cambium. We'll have a slide later on kind of with words to that effect. Okay, so the cork cambium gives rise to the periderm. Okay, then you have parenchyma cells known as the cortex. Okay, then inside of that you'll have the phloem, which are these blue V-shaped areas here. So these are phloem cells in here. And then between the phloem areas are areas of fibers, which remember are kind of sclerenchyma that lends support to the stem. Okay. Then internal to that, you have the vascular cambium, just one row of cells, one or two rows of cells that give rise to secondary phloem toward the outside, secondary xylem toward the inside. And this one has 1, 2, 3, almost 4 rings of xylem. Okay, so the stem is maybe 5 years old, 1 year for growing up and down, and then subsequent years growing to the side. Okay, in terms of girth. Okay, and that's because of the vascular cambium and because of the cork cambium. Okay? Now at the center of this section is parenchyma cells known as the pith, P-I-T-H. Okay? So that's actually the anatomy of a woody dicot, Okay? All right. Now the vascular cambium, like we just said, gives rise to secondary xylem. Okay, remember secondary xylem? What is xylem composed of? Xylem is composed of tracheids, vessel elements, parenchyma cells, fiber cells, and also ray cells, right? It also gives rise to secondary phloem. And what makes up secondary phloem? You have sieve tube members, remember, that actually move sugar solution in the plants. Okay, and you have the companion cells, which are small cells that are right up next to the sieve tube members. Okay, you have fiber cells, you have parenchyma cells, and you have ray cells also in the phloem. Okay, so remember, what does xylem do? Think about it. Remember, we just talked about that? So what does xylem do? It actually moves water and nutrients in the plant, right? Usually from the root into the stem, then into the leaves, then out of the leaves to the stomates. Now what does phloem do? Okay, phloem actually moves sugars or photosynthate, okay, from one area of the plant to the next. It can actually move from the leaves into the stem, or from the leaves to the stem into the root. Okay, or if it's actually stored somewhere in the form of starch, then it can be broken down into sugar and then translocated to where it's going to be used. Okay, so phloem transports sugar. Okay, now next, okay, another meristem is a cork cambium, also known as a phylogen. Okay, and the cork cells, which are the bark cells, of course, arise from within the cortex or from the epidermis or from the phloem. Okay, so these cork cells are impregnated with suberin, remember that, and also waxes in some cases. All right, so cork cells are non-living. They die soon after they're formed. Okay, and now the cork cells actually comprise the outer bark, okay, which reduce water loss in the plant and also protect the plant from mechanical injury. Okay. Now on the side of a young stem, you'll sometimes have stomata, okay, stomates or stomata, okay, singular stoma or stomate. Okay, these are pores in either the leaf or in the stem through which gas exchange can occur. You know, carbon dioxide can go in and oxygen gas can go out. Okay, so gas exchange, very important in plants as well as being important in us humans, right? So we take in oxygen gas and we give out carbon dioxide. Usually plants do the opposite. They'll usually take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen, even though they also use oxygen for cellular respiration or aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, so stomates actually give way to lenticels. Okay, and so lenticels form as woody stems sort of form, okay, and they develop beneath stomata. So they look like this. They're made of parenchyma cells, and if you look at them from the side, they sort of look like a little volcano. Okay, so this is something that through which the plant can do gas exchange after the cork cells are in place. Okay. Now we're going to talk about tissue patterns. Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about herbaceous dicots. Okay, herbaceous dicots are actually dicots that have soft growth to them. That means that they don't have secondary growth to them yet, so they're not rigid, they're actually pliable. You can bend them. Okay, so most flowering plants actually have their vasculature in vascular bundles. Okay, they have their xylem and their phloem in discrete bundles called vascular bundles. And in an herbaceous dicot, the vascular bundles occur in a ring around the perimeter of the section. So this is a cross section of a stem, of a herbaceous dicot stem. Okay, we can actually go through the stem anatomy here. Here you have the epidermis, okay, because it doesn't have bark yet or cork yet because it doesn't have secondary growth. And then here you have the cortex. And here in the vascular bundle, this is the vascular bundle, you have fiber cells for support, you have phloem. Okay, then you have one line of vascular cambium between the xylem and the phloem. And then what will happen is that the xylem will the vascular cambium between the adjacent vascular bundles will connect up. And then in the second year, they'll start producing xylem cells toward the inside and phloem cells to the outside. Secondary xylem to the inside, secondary phloem to the outside. Okay? Now here you have the pith. Okay, so you have the epidermis, the cortex, the vascular bundles, and the pith. Okay, so those are the main parts of an herbaceous dicot. Okay, so one of the things to remember, okay, is generally that we see here the structure of an herbaceous dicot. All right, so one of the things we talked about before were the differences between dicots and monocots. Remember them, right? So dicots, of course, they have two little seed leaves when the seed is germinating, or two cotyledons. That's where the word dicot comes from. Di means two, and cot refers to the cotyledons, right? And remember that dicots, when the root develops from the seed, actually develop a taproot system where you have one or few main roots with smaller roots coming off of it, right? And then you have monocots. Monocot, mono means one cotyledon. Okay, so monocots have one cotyledon when the seed is germinating, and they also have fibrous roots. Okay, so one of the things you're learning now is that herbaceous dicots have their vascular bundles in the stem arranged in a ring formation. Okay, and we're going to talk about other parts first, but we're going to get back to that. Now, woody dicots. Okay, woody dicots have annual rings of xylem. Okay, so in temperate climates, okay, generally all the growth happens in temperate climates during the spring and the summertime. Okay, so the spring wood tends to be lighter in color. The vessels are large, because it's actually taking up a lot of water. All right, and during the summertime you have less water, so generally the vessels are smaller, or you only have tracheates, so generally the cells tend to be darker in color. So that actually gives rise to these rings of xylem, these annual rings. Okay, so these rings of dark and light wood, okay, are actually annual rings. Okay, so most of a tree is actually annual rings. So most of the tree is actually xylem tissue. Okay, and sometimes you can tell how old the tree is by counting the rings, depending on what kind of tree it is, where it's growing. Okay, so in here, the older and the darker wood, okay, is what they call heartwood. Okay, and it's impregnated with resins and gums and tannins. Tannins are used to tan hides and things like that, and also pigments. Okay, then you have the other part, which is a younger wood, which is still functional and still moves water in the plant. Okay, and this is called sapwood. Okay, now let's go over to the side table here again. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to look at wood, okay, or some real wood and some so-called wood. So this is some real wood. Okay, you can actually see the rings, the annual rings of xylem, okay, with what used to be the pith at the very center being crushed as the stem grew wider and wider. Okay, and you can tell from this particular stem that this tree kind of was raised in pretty good conditions because the annual rings are all about the same size. They all have good, alternation of light and dark. So that means that this plant probably got regular water, okay, regular sunlight, right? So here we have some example of wood, okay, and this is basswood, okay. Now the actual science of studying the rings of wood is called dendrochronology. Okay, and what they can do is they can actually infer what happened back in the past, okay, through looking at the rings of annual rings of wood, right? And so there's also another science called dendroclimatology, where what they can do is they can infer what the climate was in the past by looking at rings of xylem. Okay, so they actually have found out that the colonists at Roanoke, and the lost colonists at Roanoke that disappeared, and also the people who survived the first winter at Jamestown. Remember, there were maybe about 80% mortality of the people who founded Jamestown. Okay, that they just happened to undergo some bad weather. Okay, what they did is they took some kind of a cypress, okay, from Virginia, and they made a core of it. And they examined the wood, and they found out that during the time of the Roanoke settlement and also of the Jamestown settlement, they unfortunately went through a very bad drought. So the crops were affected, okay, the livestock were affected, people were starving. They'd actually counted on being able to farm and pasture their animals and also to trade with the Native Americans. But the Native Americans are suffering also due to the fact of the drought, okay? Now here we have some so-called wood of monocot. This is actually hollow wood, okay? So what you see here is that you do not have annual rings. Instead, you have these little fibers coming out, okay, like that, right? So these are either fiber cells or these are vascular bundles, but they're not arranged in a ring formation. Let me show you the other side. See? They're not arranged in a ring formation. So monocots do not have true wood because they do not develop from a vascular cambium, okay? Okay, so we'll go back to the computer. Okay, here we are back again. Okay, now the bark, okay, is all the tissues outside the vascular cambium, right? So the inner part is called the phloem, okay, the outer part is called the cork cambium and cork, okay? So the thing is that generally the phloem, of course, carries sugar in it, and Native Americans made use of this, you know, in the olden days. What they used to do is they used to strip the bark from Douglas firs, which they knew had sweetness to it, and they were able to eat that during the winter time if they had a hard winter, or during hard times when they didn't have enough food, okay? Now here we have the leticifers. Leticifers are actually most common in the phloem, but they occur in all parts of the plant. Okay, and what the leticifers do, as you can guess, is they secrete latex. Okay, latex is a thick fluid, you know, like from plumerias, like when you pick a plumeria flower, like for Memorial Day to make a lei, yeah? What you have is this white latex. So latex can be white, or it can be yellow, or it can be orange, or it could be red. It's kind of like a sticky fluid, okay? And this is actually made up of gums and proteins and sugars, oils, salts, and alkaloids sometimes, and enzymes, etc. Okay? So latex of commercial interest are the latexes, latices from the rubber tree. You can see this here, collecting the latex here for rubber, right? The chicle tree, which is actually used to make gum, okay, chewing gum, right? That's where chiclets come from, is from the chicle tree. And then here you have the resin from the leticifers of the opium poppy, okay? And we know that that's made, used to make morphine and heroin and other kinds of narcotics, okay? Now we come to monocots, okay? Monocots are mostly herbaceous. They usually don't get that big because they don't have any, usually, no lateral meristems usually. Okay, they have no woody growth, as we just saw, okay? Now in monocots, the vascular bundles are scattered. That means they're scattered throughout the whole section of the cross section instead of being in a ring formation, okay? Now grasses such as wheat, rice, and barley, all right, they have intercalary meristems, right, which is at the bases of the internodes, okay. Now palm trees actually grow quite large, okay, and they have sort of growth that's sort of like the hala, which is kind of hard. Okay, so palm trees will actually grow large in diameter, right? And the reason for that is the parenchyma cells that actually make up their cortex and their pith actually keep dividing. Okay, they keep dividing, so the palm actually gets wider around, but it doesn't actually come from a secondary meristem. Now, let's see, money trees, okay, mother-in-law's tongue, and also tea plants actually do have secondary meristems. They're actually monocots that have secondary meristems. Okay, so what the secondary meristem does, it develops as a cylinder, okay, in the monocot, producing parenchyma cells to the outside and producing vascular bundles toward the inside. So you don't actually have real wood as you would before, you know, like we talked about before with the dicots. Okay. Now some of these different kinds of monocots are used for cordage. Okay, they're from the vascular bundles being scraped from the parenchyma cells. Okay, so manila hemp is one kind of cordage for monocots, and sisal is another. Now we're going to talk about specialized stems. Okay, remember these are all stems. They all have nodes and they all have internodes. Okay, one kind of a specialized stem is called a rhizome. Okay, they sort of superficially resemble roots because they're below ground. Okay, they're horizontal underground stems. Okay, they can be thick and fleshy, like iris or ginger. Okay, or they can be thin and slender, as in some ferns and some grasses. Okay, those are the rhizomes. Then we have runners and stolons. Okay, runners are horizontal and above ground. Okay, so the buds appear at the nodes, and what happens is that strawberry plants, they'll actually make new strawberry plants at the nodes when you have new growth appearing there. Okay, so in this plant you can do asexual reproduction. Also, a spider plant is another plant that does asexual reproduction through runners. Okay. Now stolons are actually below ground, and they grow in different directions, not only horizontally. Okay. So strawberries or grasses can actually grow stolons. All right. And tubers actually are at the tips of stolons. Okay, they grow at the tips of stolons. What they are, they're actually swell from the accumulation of food. So a good example of a tuber or a stem tuber is Irish potatoes. Okay, so this Irish potato is not a root. It's actually a stem, just like ginger rhizome is not a root. It's actually a stem. Okay, so they swell from food, and you have a thickened stem, and the eyes of the potato are actually the buds. Okay, are actually the nodes. Okay, bulbs, okay, tend to be large buds surrounded by leaves. Okay, there's a small stem at the bottom, and the fleshy leaves, okay, are actually the bulk of the bulb tissues. And so onions are a good example of a bulb, all right? Also tulips and lilies also make bulbs, and they can do asexual reproduction to this too. Okay. And we also have corms. Corms are vertical underground stems. Okay. So corms, like bulbs, okay, but they're actually made mostly of stem tissue. Okay. And some examples of them include gladiolus, bright, beautiful flowers here, and kalo or taro, Colocasia esculenta, which is very important locally to Hawaiian culture. Okay, also important source of carbohydrates in the diet. Okay. Now there are also cladophylls. Okay, what they are, they're leaf-like and flattened. Okay, and prickly pear cactus is a good example of that. So here you have a cladophyll of a prickly pear cactus. It looks like a leaf. Well, it's green. There's actually another stem that does photosynthesis. So how can you tell this is actually a stem and not a leaf? Well, because here you have the nodes, the areoles, right, where the spines come off, and spines are modified leaves. Okay, so the prickly pear cactus is actually, the most part of it is actually stem. Okay, so that's what you call a cladophyll. Also, some orchids also have cladophylls, and asparagus does too. Okay, now fleshy stems store water and food. So some examples of them are the cacti and the spurges. Okay, so here's a saguaro cactus from the Sonoran Desert. Okay, and here's some kind of a euphorbia, some kind of spurge. Okay, and so spurges tend to have a milky latex exuding when you injure them or break off a piece. Now thorns are modified stems, modified for protection. Okay, a good example of a plant that has thorns is the honey locust. Okay, so remember that thorns are specialized stems. Remember that spines are actually modified leaves. Also, prickles from roses or from raspberries actually originate from the epidermis. Okay, so they're not actually either stem tissue or leaf tissue. They're actually from the epidermis instead. Okay. Now tendrils tend to wrap around support or whatever they're growing on or upon. So grapes is a good example of the stem adaptation known as a tendril. Okay, so now we're going to go and take a look at some stem adaptations. Hi. Okay, so we have here some food, which is always good. Yes. So one type of modified stem is a rhizome. We have here ginger. Okay. So here at these lines you have the nodes, and the area between the lines are the internodes, and they're covered by sort of like a scale-like leaves. Okay. And of course gingers are can be a problem, not this edible ginger, but gingers that you might have in your yard. If you like ginger, it's very pretty. You know, they're good plants, they're hardy plants, they grow very well. But sometimes plants that grow very well sometimes grow too well. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll overstep their bounds and they'll grow into other places that you don't want them to grow. So you might get tired of having whatever kind of ginger, whether it's red ginger or torch ginger or white ginger or yellow ginger, which have beautiful smells. Yes, but still, you might get tired of them, and you have to dig them out completely, or they'll come back. Okay, so gingers are also pests in the Hawaiian forest. They have a tendency to grow too prolifically, take up too much room, take up too much water, and crowd out other plants as well. Okay, now here we have onion bulb. Okay, so I actually cut this a few minutes ago because I didn't want to make a mistake on camera. That turned out to be a good thing. Okay, so what we have here is you have the leaf bases, and this is the part of the onion that we eat, right? The part that smells so good if you like onions and are so smelly when you don't like onions, right? And here you have the little stem right here, okay, where the leaf bases are coming off of. Okay, so bulbs. And then here you actually have the little adventitious roots growing from the base of the stem. Okay, and then we have here some araimo or dashin. Okay, you can actually see that some parts are greening up. It's probably been exposed to some light. Okay, so this is a corm. Okay, this is araimo, or some people call it a version of kalo. Okay, but it's actually not a root. It's actually a stem, an underground vertical stem. Okay, and here you have a little cormel or a little propagule coming off. You could actually take it off and plant it and have a new plant. So these different kind of stem adaptations allow you to do some vegetative reproduction as well. And then here we have, what is it? It's a potato, right? It's a white potato or Irish potato, right? You can see that it's swollen, and anybody who's ever eaten a baked potato knows how good it is, or even mashed potato, all those starches, especially if you put butter and sour cream and chives and everything like that on it, right? So here you have the fact that you have a swollen stem with the eyes that are actually where the buds come from, that are actually the nodes. And the area between the eyes are called the internodes. So this is actually an underground storage stem, okay, called a tuber, right? Then lastly here, we have a cactus, okay? And this, of course, actually shows the areoles here, where the spines, modified leaves are coming out of. So what is the phyllotaxy of this? Okay, think about it, all right? So here you actually have the fact that it's green. So this is a photosynthetic stem. This is also a stem that does water retention, stores water. It's a little shriveled because we're not giving it as much water as we used to, which is a good thing, because the easiest way to kill a plant is by giving it too much water. Okay, it's the fastest and easiest way to kill a plant is to overwater it. Okay, so here we have the areoles, right? And so how about that question I asked you a little while ago? What is a phyllotaxy? Well, these are nodes, and they have more than 3 spines or modified leaves coming out of it. So it's actually a whorl leaf arrangement. Okay, so phyllotaxy is whorled. Okay, so now we'll go back to the computer. Okay, here we are again. Okay, now wood. Okay, wood is actually made up of 50% water when it's fresh. Okay, and wood has been used for fuel and shelter and many other uses since antiquity by humans. Okay, so it's up to 50% water. Okay, so because it's up to 50% water, if you want to use wood for a purpose, it needs to be seasoned. Okay, so you decrease the water content to around 10% or less. Now the dry part of the wood is made up of 60 to 75% cellulose. Okay, 15 to 25% lignin. Remember the idea of cellulose fibrils in a matrix of lignin, sort of like rebar in a matrix of concrete, right? And the remainder of the parts of the wood is resins, gums, oils, dyes, tannins, and starch. Okay, so the oils and the tannins are important in terms of wood preservation. Okay, now properties of wood. Okay, the density is one of the properties of wood that need concern us. Okay, so the density of most things are actually compared to the density of water. Okay, so density of water is the weight per unit volume of water, and everything is compared to that, right? So if wood weighs the same as water, it has a specific gravity of 1. Okay, if it weighs less than water, it has a specific gravity of less than 1, and if it's heavier than water, it has a specific gravity of more than 1. Okay, now most woods actually have a specific gravity of less than 1, okay, due to the air spaces in the wood, and they generally range from 0.04 to 1.40 in terms of density, weight per unit volume. Now light wood includes balsa, breadfruit, and wili, and of course locally, breadfruit and wili or ulu and wili were used for surfboards, right? Very light wood, okay? Now very heavy wood, maybe the heaviest, is something called lignum vitae. That's not the scientific name, that's actually the common name of that plant, okay? So that's so heavy that they're used in submarines as bearings because they're heavy and they're persistent, and what they'll do is they'll do self-lubricating, and also at the same time they're not as noisy as metal bearings. Okay. Now the durability of wood is another characteristic of wood, the ability to withstand decay. So what you need to do is you need to decrease the moisture in wood by seasoning. Okay, you can either air dry wood in stacks, or you can actually dry them in a kiln at controlled temperatures. Okay. Now those tannins and oils that I mentioned a little earlier, what they do is they repel decay organisms such as fungi. Okay, so what they do is they can help to increase the durability of woods. Okay, so the most durable woods are cedar, catalpa, and black locust. Look how beautiful that is. And the least durable are willow, fir, and basswood. Remember, we looked at basswood a little earlier. Okay. Okay, types of sawing. Okay. The long ways along the radius or perpendicular to the rays is what they call quarter sawed boards. Okay. It shows the annual rings in side view as long streaks, right? So there are only a few quarter sawed boards that can be gotten from a log. So it's of course much more expensive than the other kind of sawing, which is called plain sawed or slab cut boards. And these are cut perpendicular to the rays, okay, and the rings appear as swirls and patches, right? Now knots are actually bases of lost branches, all right? So these are old branches lower down in the stem, okay, and they're covered by new wood produced by the candium, okay? So there are more knots in the older parts of the log toward the center, and knots usually weaken the board. The more knots are in the board, the more weak the board is. Okay, now wood products, okay, include lumber for construction. So in the United States, about half of the lumber is used, okay, or wood is used as lumber, okay? And a waste product of the sawing of the lumber is sawdust, which is used to make particle board and also use pulp. And pulp is the next most extensive uses for wood, okay? And it's used to make paper, synthetics, linoleum, okay, and plastics, right? Now other wood products include charcoal, excelsior, you know, that stuff you find in your Easter basket, cooperage, which includes kegs, casks, and barrels, okay, boxes and crates, musical instruments, tool handles, pilings, also cellophane and Christmas trees. In fact, the uses of wood are so diverse, you know, it's really hard to be able to enumerate all of them. Okay, now in half of the developing countries, I'm sorry, I misspoke. About half of the wood is actually used for fuel in developing countries, okay? But in the United States, less than 10% is actually used for fuel, okay? In the early 2000s in Brazil, they were using waste wood to power their utilities, but it caused all kinds of problems. They actually decreased in wood really quickly, okay? And they also tended to run out of it really fast. Another thing is it contributed to the greenhouse effect and global warming. Okay, so even the use of charcoal or coal and also petroleums or fossil fuels are problematic because of the pollution they cause, and also because ways of extracting these materials are often very destructive to the land, okay? So we need less destructive ways of getting our energy needs met. Okay, so let's review what we covered today. Okay, we covered the functions of the stem, including some of the parts of the stem. We talked about tissues from the apical meristem. We talked about secondary meristems. We talked about dicots and monocots. Difference between dicots and monocots, and we'll go into more of that later. We talked about some specialized stems, and we also talked about wood. Okay, that's all we have for you today. That was quite a lot to cover, I know. Okay, so if you need any help, be sure to contact me. Okay, if you need me to review things with you or go over things with you again, I'd be happy to. Okay, so until next time, I'll see you. Okay, bye-bye.